I wonder what was the last film you cried at? Assuming, of course, that you've cried at a film. I wonder if it was maybe Titanic or Bambi or Schindler's List or E.T. For me, it's probably any film really, but definitely any of the Disney children's animated films. We love stories, whether they're in films, books, or on the TV, because we connect with stories. And when we hear a well-told story, something in our brain reacts in such a way that we experience that story for ourselves. And this is scientifically proven. There's something about facts which activate a data processing center in our brains, but when we hear stories, it activates a sensory center in our brains. And it also releases a feel-good hormone called oxytocin, which makes us as a listener or as an audience place ourselves into the character's story. And it boosts our feelings of empathy, of compassion, and of trust. And maybe that's why the book of Jonah is so popular. And maybe that's why when it was written by the original author, they did so in a way to make it a well-told story, not just a standard historical account. And I believe there is much to prove that Jonah is a historical story and not just a fictitious story with a moral slant on it. And there's two very important arguments to back that up. The first being reference to Jonah in 2 Kings chapter 14, where it talks about him being a prophet in the reign of Jeroboam II. And then Jesus makes reference to Jonah as well in the New Testament. And I think these are fairly good indicators that Jonah was in fact a real historical character. But maybe there's been a reason why that creative use of narrative has been used in telling the story. Maybe the whole point of Jonah is that we allow ourselves to step fully into the story, connecting with Jonah on a deep level. And a story must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so today we start at the beginning, the once upon a time part of our story. And as with any beginning of a story, we must introduce ourselves to the characters, allowing ourselves to see the events that are about to take place, the things that are going to set things in motion. And that's called the story arc, which involves the tensions and the conflicts that are going to be highlighted in the story before we come to the end of the story, which ideally is wrapped up in a satisfying way so that we all feel good at the end of it. This is the happily ever after moment. But today, before we run on too far ahead, we enter into the story of Jonah at the beginning. And I want us to connect with Jonah and to put ourselves in his shoes, to experience for ourselves that journey that Jonah is about to embark on as he wrestles with some of the issues in this book. So we begin with once upon a time. And we need to find out a little bit about our protagonist, understanding the plot and allowing ourselves to get a feel for the different locations that we're going to be visiting. So let's start with Jonah. Now, we may assume that the main character of the story is Jonah, but actually it isn't. It's God. In the book of Jonah, the fish is mentioned 4 times, the city of Nineveh is mentioned 9 times, Jonah is mentioned 18 times, but God is mentioned 38 times. But seeing as the character that we're probably most going to be able to relate to is Jonah, we're going to be concentrating on him. And Jonah's life is fairly comfortable when we pick up our story. Unusually for a prophet, he's popular amongst his people, mainly because he's telling them the things that they want to hear, good things that God is going to do. Jonah had prophesied that Israel would be able to expand her boundaries And in 2 Kings chapter 14, we hear that this has happened. It says, in accordance with the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, spoken through his servant Jonah, son of Amittai, the prophet from Gath-hepher. And there would have been much joy and excitement, I'm sure, at this news that God was going to bless Israel and maybe make her a prominent nation in the world. And Jonah has been the one who's been able to speak this message of encouragement in their spell in this history of the world. And it's very easy to tell people things that they want to hear. Jonah is comfortable amongst his own people, he's popular, and is well liked. He's doing things for God that would have been easy to do. And this may resonate with where we're at currently. Maybe we're in a particular comfortable time, and maybe even as a church, this is where we are at the moment. Which is fine, unless, of course, God wants to change the status quo and God wants to call us out of our comfort zones. Almost everything in God's plans calls for a breaking out of our comfort zone and taking some risk. We only have to look at Abraham. He was called out of a great civilization into a land that he knew nothing about. He needed to give up his security and comfort and to head west. And that was the beginning of the people of God because of his obedience and coming out of his comfort zone. And this is what Jesus says in Luke chapter 9, verse 23 in the Living Bible. Then he said to all, and notice that small word, but very important word, all, anyone who wants to follow me must put aside his own desires and conveniences and carry his cross with him every day and keep close to me. We're called to be content, but not necessarily comfortable. Being content in the good and the bad, the highs and the low. As Paul says in Philippians 4 verse 11, I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. Rather than letting his comfort zone dictate his behavior and actions, Paul is allowing his behavior and his actions to dictate his comfort zone. And comfort can impede our progress. Comfort can cause resistance to change. Comfort can make us inward looking, when in fact God is calling us not to look at our own conveniences, but to think about what may benefit others. In our story, the tranquility of Jonah's life is about to take a turn. The word of the Lord comes to Jonah and he is told to go to Nineveh. Nineveh was the capital city of Assyria, and it was the mortal enemy of Israel. The inhabitants of Nineveh had a reputation for extreme cruelty and brutality. Nineveh was also a Gentile city, and no one spoke Hebrew there, although they did speak Aramaic, which is why Jonah was able to communicate and make himself understood there. But Hebrew prophets would have been particularly unwelcome in Nineveh. And certainly it would have been understandable that they would not welcome anyone prophesying particularly something bad, a warning that the way that they are living is going to cause their destruction. The prophet Nahum writes this about the Ninevites. Woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims. The crack of whips, the clatter of wheels, galloping horses and jolting chariots. Many casualties, piles of dead bodies without number, people stumbling over the corpses. And I won't go into the details of some of the horrific things that the Ninevites did to other people. But Nineveh is more than this. In our story, Nineveh is the place that we don't want to go, or the place that we refuse to go. Nineveh is the thing that God has been speaking to us about, maybe, but we refuse to listen or submit to his will. That place for us might be undealt with sin. It might be God's call on our lives for a deeper commitment to him. It might be a place of rebellion, or somewhere in our hearts where we're storing up unforgiveness. And on the subject of unforgiveness, a little boy was once asked what forgiveness is. His reply was, "It is the odour that flowers give when they are trampled upon. Take a rose, step on it, pick it up, and then smell the fragrance." And I thought, what a lovely definition of what forgiveness is. And I wonder, even today, what perhaps we smell like. Possibly our most important enterprise as a Christian is to imitate Christ and to find and follow the will of God. In Romans chapter 12, verse 2, it says, "Do not conform to the pattern of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." It's one thing to not know the will of God and to miss it. It's an altogether different thing to know the will of God and refuse it. Nineveh creates a tension in our life. Nineveh in Jonah's story and in our story is a place where God is not Lord. And I wonder today what Nineveh represents for us. So what happens when we refuse to go to Nineveh? We go to Tarshish instead. Tarshish is the place of running away. Tarshish was a city on the far western side of the Mediterranean Sea, the equivalent to the ends of the earth for Jonah. It's the furthest he could have gone. When it says that Jonah ran away from the Lord, it literally means to run from the face of the Lord. And this doesn't mean that God couldn't see Jonah. It means he didn't have God's approval or favour. Tarshish is a place that always seems attractive. Maybe for you, it's the place where the grass is always greener. We have difficulties in our relationships, in our workplaces, in our churches, and we think to ourselves, I'll quit, I'll leave, I'll finish that, and we'll go someplace else, we'll start a new relationship. The grass often appears greener, but it often doesn't take long for us to realise that it isn't greener. We just take our problems and our issues from one patch to another. The historical city of Tarshish was equally appealing. Its name actually means gem, and it was famous for its ships, which carried gold, silver, iron, tin, lead, ivory, apes and monkeys. So not only was it a place of wealth and prosperity, but it would also have appeared exotic and exciting to Jonah. And there are many things that can entice us away from the will of God. Rabbi and biblical scholar Sheldon Blank says this about Tarshish. What is Tarshish? In the story, it is anywhere but the right place. It is the opposite direction, the direction a person takes when he turns his back on his destiny. It is the excuse we give, our rationalization. But before Jonah can start his escape, there has to be a point of departure. And that departure point is Joppa. The journey away from God can be gradual and often starts from a place of self-righteousness and justification for our thoughts and for our actions. And ensconced in our self-righteousness, we can convince ourselves that we are in the right place. For Jonah, Joppa is where he just happens to find a boat going where he wants to go. Surely this means that God is on his side. When we decide to disobey God, there is always a boat going to Tarshish, and there's always room for one more passenger. Equally, we'll always have company, because we all like to be with people who don't challenge our behaviour or criticise our decisions. What we don't know when we get to this departure point is how far God will let us go. Sometimes the judgment of God is simply that he lets us go and get on with our sin, and eventually we face the consequences of our own disobedience. And this might be described as severe mercy. That's what Romans 1 means when it repeatedly says that God gave them over to their sin. When a person or a society decides that they or it don't need God, God's response may not always be to bring about a thunderbolt or indeed a big fish to swallow us up. More often than not, God says, if you want to pursue this particular path, if you want to go against my contrary will, I've warned you, but if that's what you want to do, go and do it. But you will have consequences. And indeed, there are perhaps no two sadder words than "but Jonah" in our story. God gives Jonah a command, but Jonah. However, we can thank God that the theme of our story in Jonah is God's grace. Jonah hasn't got off to a great start, but we're only at the beginning of our story. We're only at the once upon a time part. As we place ourselves into this story, where are we at the moment? Where is our once upon a time moment for us? Could it be that God is calling you, us, out of our comfort zone, challenging us about areas that we refuse to go, or the conditions that we put on God's grace and love? Does God want to disturb our personal peace so that we will arise, get up, and go to whatever he is calling us to? Whatever the case and whatever our response, there is one thing we should not be mistaken about. We cannot outrun God, as we shall see as we continue the story next week.